Hello, everyone. Today we're going to be working on lesson 3 of the historical packet. The lesson involves understanding the difference between primary and secondary sources. The lesson essential question: how do we determine if a historical document is a primary or secondary source? We're going to look at two different source types. For example, the first source type deals with a diary of Anne Frank that was written by Anne Frank herself, and the other source type is a document created after the time period being studied. And from that, we're going to understand the difference between a primary and secondary source. In general, a primary source is an account based on someone's personal experiences involving the situation. So if a person was personally there at the event, it's considered a primary source. But if you're getting a source from secondhand information, someone who was not directly involved in the event, that's considered a secondary source. In this activity, you're going to understand the difference between primary and secondary sources. To help us further, we're going to look at this video, which helps us understand. So please follow and listen.
This is a short video to introduce you to primary and secondary sources. I'll answer the questions: what's the difference between primary and secondary sources? How can I tell the difference between the two? And where can I find sources? A primary source is a document or physical object that was written or created during the time under study. Primary sources were present during an experience or time period and offer an inside view of a particular event. Some types of primary sources include original documents, such as a speech, photograph, news film footage, a letter, an interview, or written documents such as a memoir, a manuscript, or an autobiography.
Let's remember that a speech, a photograph, a television interview, a letter, okay, or an original manuscript. If someone originally wrote it, it's considered a primary source. In order for that to be the case, the person or a group of people had to be involved or around during the time situation.
Examples of primary sources include diaries, such as the Diary of Anne Frank, President Eisenhower's farewell address, a film of the Wright brothers' flight, or a journal article reporting new research or findings. A secondary source interprets, analyzes, or draws conclusions about events reported in a primary source.
So, therefore, if you're interpreting or draw a conclusion, that means you are not actually involved in the situation. That is the main distinction between primary sources and secondary sources.
Secondary sources are one or more steps removed from the event. They may have pictures, quotes, or graphics of primary sources in them. Some types of secondary sources include publications, such as textbooks, magazine articles, histories, criticisms, commentaries, and encyclopedias.
Please have this to memory: textbooks, magazine articles, which includes newspaper articles, as long as it's something that was written after the event. Historical articles, criticisms, commentaries, and encyclopedias. You guys may not know about encyclopedias, but these are books which indicate different events and situations, but they're told from a secondhand experience. Oftentimes, they're written after the event occurred, long after.
Some examples of secondary sources include a journal or magazine article which interprets or reviews previous findings, a history textbook, or a book about the effects of World War I. Ask yourself these questions to decide whether a source is primary or secondary. How does the author know these details, such as names, dates, and times? Was the author present at the event or soon on the scene? Where does this information come from? Personal experience, eyewitness accounts, or reports written by others? Are the author's conclusions based on a single piece of evidence, or have many sources been taken into account? For example, diary entries along with third party eyewitness accounts and newspaper accounts. Primary and secondary source material is available through the library databases as well as from reputable sites on the internet. Our Canvas course site contains a list of sites where you can discover primary sources and suggestions for searching databases in the library catalog.
Okay, so just remember the main distinction between primary and secondary sources. If it's a source in which it's determined that the person was involved in the event or was actually there at the time period, it is considered a primary source. If it's a secondhand account, then it's considered secondary. Now, after our actual lesson relating to this topic, the activity involved is here. You're going to read these different scenarios and you're going to determine whether you consider them primary or secondary sources. Keep in mind that the source indication is bolded. So you'll understand that there's a journal entry, a biography, a textbook chapter, a photograph, an autobiography, a newspaper article, a letter, and a sword that was made in 1317. So you have to determine whether they are primary or secondary sources. Highlight which source type that you think it is, like this, and you click yellow to highlight. And then after you highlight each source type, based on your understanding of the lesson, you will determine if it's primary or secondary. Please fill in whether it's primary or secondary here, and then give a brief explanation as to why you think this is a primary or secondary source. So this is the lesson that we're going to do. We're going to work on it together. Please let me know if you have any questions or concerns. Thank you very much.